Well, I see about half the room's cleared out, so I guess that's appropriate. For an ex-banker, I'm hoping one of these days that we can drop that moniker. I don't know how old I have to get before I'm no longer an ex-banker, but perhaps once I get through my legal troubles of being a banker, we'll hope that happens one of these days. So Guido was talking about the evils of central banking and creating fiat money. And my subject today is, the good thing is that they are very independent, these central bankers. They don't have to kowtow to government at all or to politicians. They are completely separate, we're told. They are very wise men and women who, are not seeking any sort of social climbing or any sort of personal gratification that way. They're all just level-headed, very geeky economists. And so it's worked out very well that we have these wise people running central banks. And in fact, on September 10th in the Wall Street Journal, I guess that's just a day in front of whatever it's called now in the United States. Patriots Day is now September 11th. There was a piece about the Federal Reserve's too cozy relations with banks by a couple of academics. They actually lead their piece with the Federal Reserve was established in 1914 as independent of the President and Congress. And for good reason. The Fed's founders understood that politicians had to be blocked from using monetary policy to juice the economy before elections. Extensive research supports the wisdom of the Fed's political independence. Monetary policy works best when it is insulated from the vagaries of the election cycle. So thank goodness. Thank goodness that the Fed just doesn't even know where the executive office is, doesn't know where the president's office is, except in doing some work on Arthur Burns. Come to find out, that is actually not the case. Now, if you don't remember Arthur Burns, he was the 10th Federal Reserve Chairman, and in fact, at the time, he was considered to, by none other than that champion of free markets, Milton Friedman. Well, maybe not in this room, not a champion of free markets, but Milton said that Arthur Burns had, he said none of Arthur Burns' predecessors had any training or special competence in the problems of the economy as a whole. And that Arthur Burns was the only person with the experience or the first person ever named chairman of the board who had the right qualifications for that job. Now, if that sounds familiar, they actually just said that recently about Janet Yellen. So we'll see if Janet Yellen turns out to be as good as Arthur Burns was. But what Friedman said was that the previous central bankers, having never been PhDs, they were generally business people. They ran companies, they ran banks. They only had experience in individual business or financial institutions. So these people were essentially unqualified, according to Milton Friedman. Now, we have to remember that Friedman was very close to Burns. He studied under him at Columbia, and in fact, he said, "Save my parents and wife, no one has influenced my life more than Arthur." And in his column in Newsweek, Friedman said that he wrote that the Fed had been operating under erroneous philosophy of monetary policy. He said that they had been preoccupied with focusing on interest rates, regulation of individual banking activities. He said the key function of the Fed was the function of creating money and the control quantity money, and that Arthur Burns will not make the mistake of being too tight with money. Now, of course, Burns had no experience in the real world, and evidently that's why Friedman thought that he was uniquely qualified to run the Fed. He had been a college professor, and he had worked for government. And again, if that sounds familiar, that's exactly Janet Yellen's qualifications that we currently have. Now, Burns had worked in government under Dwight D. Eisenhower as a economic advisor from 1953 to 1956. And in fact, Dwight D. Eisenhower had told Burns, he said, "Arthur, you'll make a fine chief of staff during the war." And Burns actually treasured that compliment for the rest of his life. As you'll find out, Burns was constantly trying to seek gratification from the president and other people in government. He developed this tight relationship with a certain vice president of Eisenhower's, and of course that was Richard Nixon. Burns thought highly of Nixon. In fact, he said, quote, "It's extraordinary that he's been so unpopular over the years with intellectuals. He's really one of us," unquote. So Arthur Burns thought that Richard Nixon was an intellectual. One biographer said, Burns loved to be near the center of government power. He worked very hard at his job and was devoted to the president. He was extremely vulnerable to presidential flattery, particularly the flattery of being told the inside story and being in the know. So essentially what we had with Arthur Burns is a guy who was a political social climber. Now, we also assume that Fed chairmen are, as I said before, kind of nerdy guys who don't get out much. But Burns was probably the first social creature, he was called, according to one friend. His manners were courtly, his nature was warm. For instance, he never failed to hold the elevator for others or to inquire about a sick child or a spouse. He was especially popular among women who appreciated his gallant attitude toward them. And in fact, you can see that this attitude that Burns had rubbed off on his star pupil, Greenspan, who would end up dating a number of prominent women as he was making the rounds in Washington. Now, Burns was thought to be laissez-faire economist while he was at Columbia, but he dropped that. He decided to become Keynesian in practice. According to Burns, politics was the art of governing in an imperfect environment. Burns' philosophy not only affected his actions, of course, but again, Greenspan, who was his student, and many have noted the parallels between the two men. Friedman said that Burns was an expert on the business cycle. He understands the monetary system and its relation to the economy at a depth and subtlety that has not been equaled by the past of any chairman of the board. So again, we had a gentleman at the head of the Fed that was essentially at the right place at the right time and would punch all the right buttons to make the economy work. When he took over, he was said to be very smart, but he was never in doubt of the correctness of his opinions. For the start, Arthur Burns displayed an unshakable sense of his own importance. Exactly the kind of guy that you want at the Fed. So Richard Nixon's elected president in 1968, and the close association with Burns would certainly benefit Burns in a very big way. But there was a problem, and the problem was William McChesney Martin, who was already at the Fed, or the chairman of the Fed. So Nixon met with Martin and thought that he had Martin's agreement that he would step down after the election. Well, that didn't happen, and Martin didn't step down. And Nixon already disliked Martin. He blamed him for his loss in the 1960 election. And once he took office, the president was sure that Martin would try to ruin him. And in June of '69, Martin was quoted as saying the U.S. economy was a house of cards, and he firmed up the Fed funds rate and stopped monetary growth. And of course, Nixon was livid. It's hard to imagine today any Federal Reserve Chairman calling the U.S. economy a house of cards, even though it could be called a house of cards. None would ever do it. So Nixon really wasn't interested, as most people know, he was very interested in foreign policy. He was bored by economics. In fact, he only devoted one sentence of his inaugural speech to the economy, but that would change as early as 1971 when he told George Shultz, quote, "When we get through, this Fed won't be independent if it's the only thing I do in this office," unquote. So immediately when Nixon took over, he wanted Burns on his staff. Burns resisted, but Nixon's flattery was able to win him over. And so he hired Burns to coordinate domestic policy matters and cabinet members, getting the administration off to a good start. They had a different relationship, though, before, when Nixon was a vice president. Burns was the older man. Nixon was in a more subservient position. And Burns actually treated Nixon with slight condescension, according to one friend. But now that Nixon was in charge, Burns had trouble adjusting to the roles being reversed. And Burns had this avuncular style that drove Nixon just crazy. Burns would contradict the president or anyone else in the administration for whom he disagreed. Nixon began to dread talking to Burns at all. In fact, he got it down to where Burns was only allowed to meet with the president half an hour a week. He also rubbed Nixon's two key lieutenants the wrong way, John Ehrlichman and H.R. Haldeman. They told their boss that Burns was a blowhard who was unable to distinguish trivia from actual information, and the feeling was mutual. He thought Haldeman and Ehrlichman as clerks that were promoted above their natural talents and referred to them as the boys in the basement. Burns quickly wore thin at the White House, and as I said before, he only got half an hour a week. And at the same time, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, another Nixon staffer, began to get the president's ear. And Nixon said 4 minutes with Pat is worth 4 hours of Arthur Burns. But finally, the time came for William Martin to step down. He didn't really want to do it. In fact, Burns had lunch with him in early 1969, and Burns wrote in his diary about Martin. He said, "Poor fellow, he thinks he owns the Fed and has suddenly discovered that he is so indispensable that that job must not go, though law requires it, to anyone else. Pathetic slob," is what Burns called Martin. So when Burns he finally takes the oath in January 1970, and Nixon said, I have some very strong views on some of these economic matters, and I can assure you that I will convey them privately and strongly to Dr. Burns. I respect his independence. However, I hope that independently he will concede that my views are the ones that should be followed." Unquote. So as Burns was standing there soaking up the standing ovation that he was getting, Nixon broke in and said, "You see, Dr. Burns, that is a standing vote of appreciation in advance for lower interest rates and more money." And later in private, Nixon told the new Fed chair, "You see to it, no recession." So his marching orders were pretty clear. But Burns was a tough guy to work for. They said he was mean. He was vindictive. He was vengeful, revengeful. Fed officials such as William Poole, Jim Price, Darrell Francis, others who were very prominent at the Fed at the time quit because of him. In fact, there's this story that one biographer wrote that of a financial journalist called Sanford Rose, who had penned an article at Fortune about a Federal Open Market Committee meeting in 1972, and Burns couldn't get the vote that he wanted to go his way for more stimulus. So what he did is he just went ahead and left the meeting for an hour, and then he came back and said, "I just talked to the White House," essentially to get the vote turned around. And this Rose said the article itself was not all that remarkable. The only remarkable thing was the effort that Arthur Burns put into getting me fired. So even if journalists called out Arthur Burns, he was attempting to exert force on them. And of course, they thought that Arthur Burns, as an academic, would be open to ideas, but he's not amenable to factual arguments at all, it was said. In truth, of course, he wouldn't look at a piece of evidence to save his soul. That's what has been said about him. The Fed staff under Burns acquired the habit of believing that it worked for the chairman, not for the board. In fact, instead of having formal votes, what Burns would do would sample sentiment to skirt the law that required a vote be disclosed to the public. In one case, when a vote was deadlocked at 6-6, Burns said, quote, "By the narrowest of margins, this 6 wins. I would like to have a recount, 12-0, unquote. And after the Freedom of Information Act began to rear its ugly head, Burns simply stopped keeping transcripts altogether. So we get into 1971, unemployment rate stuck at 6%. Wages are going up all over, telephone workers, big increases, so on and so forth. Money supply was expanding at a rapid rate, 8.3%, so on and so forth. But Burns felt like unemployment was still too high, employment was still tepid, so he was reluctant to shut off the tap at all or to increase interest rates. So his solution was central planning, force. Solution was an incomes policy that would control wages by government. He believed he actually believed inflation caused unemployment. He went before a congressional committee and he said, the rules of economics are not working the way they used to. Despite intensive unemployment in our country, wage rate increases have not moderated. Despite much idle industrial capacity, commodity prices continue to rise rapidly. So the Nixon White House was not pleased with the chair. In fact, they thought he was working for the Democratic Party by talking about these wage controls. Nixon wanted to have the bold ideas. He didn't want bold ideas coming out of the Fed. And Burns wrote that he was told during a meeting with the president that while my status was a special one, I too will be expected to conform to publicly announced administration policies, that my advocacy or comments on non-monetary matters was being interpreted widely as administration policy because of my friendship with the president that everyone knew. So essentially, he was told that he needed to start towing the line. Burns wrote in his diary at this time about this meeting that Nixon was uncontrolled cruelty, that he was seized suddenly with the fear for the safety of our country that depended so heavily on this insecure man. The thought flashed through my mind of an earlier conversation when he asked me to inform him when I thought it would be a good time to bring on an international monetary crisis, and added, winking privately as he spoke, "I don't mind crisis," the I being heavily underlined. So Nixon, if anybody was going to cause a crisis, it was Nixon who wanted to do it, and he wanted to make sure that Burns would carry out those plans. Burns called the president imperial at the time, and he concluded in a diary, now I knew that I would be accepted in the future only if I suppressed my will and yielded completely, even though it was wrong at law and morally to his authority. So again, I think Fed independence has certainly gone out the window at this point. That wasn't enough for Nixon. He felt like he needed to discredit Burns. At this point, again, he was mad at him for still advocating policies and essentially stealing the thunder of the administration. So Nixon floated the rumor that Burns had asked for a 50% raise. It was actually not true. The Office of Management and Budget, the OMB, had actually recommended a 50% raise, and Burns had turned it down, but Nixon wanted to float that rumor just to make him look bad. Nixon also floated the rumor that the Federal Reserve Board would be increased from 7 to 14, and that the central bank would be placed under the authority of the White House, just to rattle the chairman. So this had Burns on the run. He was doing all he could to build support on Capitol Hill. He felt like he was under attack, but all it took to bring him around was for Nixon to publicly say, "Arthur Burns has taken an unfair shot," and that was enough to take care of Burns. He said of his friend's comment, meaning the president, "I haven't been so deeply moved in years. This proves what a decent and warm man the president is." So talk about a lack of backbone from Arthur Burns. Of course, by this time, 1971's coming around, and you know what's coming. The British government accelerated the White House agenda when it requested a guarantee to cover $750 million of its holdings, gold holdings. And so the Brain Trust met at Camp David, and they put together a plan that was essential, at least in Burns's view, to read his diary, that was essential for the campaign of 1972. There was a 90-day wage freeze, 10% tax on imports, stimulus measures, repeal on the excise tax on auto, expand personal income tax deductions. Finally, the gold window would be closed, with the U.S. refusing to redeem dollars in gold. The agenda was exactly what Burns wanted. except for the removal of the gold standard. He couldn't support that, but he felt like he needed to go along with what the president had in mind. He wrote in his diary, "The weekend confirmed my growing feeling that the president needs to act in a way that satisfies his hunger for drama and novelty, that he lacks the true self-assurance, and that he therefore requires some dramatic act to convince himself that he was a strong leader and that his prejudices, or shall I say principles, will not survive clear evidence that the political winds require a change." In '72, the Nixon administration worried that money was too tight, but Burns writes in his diary, "I told him that I was looking after monetary policy, that he need not be concerned about the possibility that the Fed would starve the economy." So again, Burns was there to have Nixon's back. Money supply grew 8.5% in 1972. It would go on from there. I think we know what happens as far as CPI goes. It was up over 6% in '73. '74, it doubled to 11%, and then from '75 to '81, it bounced between essentially 6% and 13.5%. So this was essentially stagflation, is what was brought about by Burns in trying to keep his boss, Nixon, keep him in office and keep him reelected. But Burns, after he retired, he said the fact that inflation started in the mid-'60s was mainly caused by large deficits continued year after year by the federal budget. So he doesn't take any blame for stepping on the monetary gas. He said in a '76 speech, he said the business community's exuberant mood and waves of speculation, it's that old waves of speculation that caused inflation. Participants in the, he admitted central banks were participants in the inflationary process, but only as a subsidiary, is the way he put it. He said central bankers' practical capacity for curbing an inflation that is continually driven by political forces is very limited, he said. So, with the selection of Burns as the Fed chairman, the management of the central bank in the United States, at least, changed really forever. It's been PhDs ever since, except for 17 months. His successor was not a PhD, but ever since, we've had PhDs ever since. And they think they know what buttons to push and what levers to pull to make the economy hum. But I think more importantly, they know how to keep their jobs in terms of taking their direction from the White House. And Burns wasn't the only social animal. He was susceptible to flattery, constant status seeking, but also Alan Greenspan was the same way. If you remember what Ayn Rand said about her collective member Greenspan, "Oh, Alan is so brilliant, but he's such a social climber," is what Ayn Rand said about him. Greenspan dated Kay Bailey Hutchinson, Barbara Streisand, before marrying Andrea Mitchell, and the maestro, as he's been called, was seduced by Washington's high society lifestyle. So, as we've worshipped these PhDs, we've called them Man of the Year, Person of the Year. They grace the covers of magazines, but you know, they've done everything to make matters worse. It's ironic that while Burns was still on the job as Fed chair, F.A. Hayek delivered his Nobel Prize acceptance speech entitled The Pretense of Knowledge on December 11, 1974. And Hayek spoke about economists like Burns who believe that there, quote, exists a simple positive correlation between the total employment and the size of the aggregate demand for goods and services. It leads to the belief that we can permanently assure full employment by maintaining total money expenditure at appropriate level. And that might work in the social sciences, as Hayek claims, but such complex phenomenon as the market, which depend on the actions of many individuals, all the circumstances which will determine the outcome of a problem will hardly ever be known or measurable. In his conclusion, Hayek urged caution to men striving to control society, that very striving which makes him not only a tyrant over his fellows, but which may well make him the destroyer of a civilization which no brain has designed, but which has grown from the free efforts of millions of individuals. So the human hand should not manage money, no matter what qualifications these PhDs may have. They will only have enough knowledge to be dangerous. What we can know for sure, as long as PhDs continue to run the central bank, monetary and market chaos will continue. Thank you.